What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another treasure format video. And in this video, I'm going to be going through the major strategies in treasure format and ranking them on a tier list, just like I've done for all the past formats that I've covered. The tiers will go all the way from tier 0, which means that, there's a deck that is the most powerful deck in the format and nothing else can even compete with it, to trash, which is just a deck is utterly terrible and really can't win any games. In between these two rankings, we've got tier 1, which are the best decks of the format if it isn't a tier 0 format, the decks that you can reasonably see at the top tiers of competitive play, and decks that will likely win you a fair amount of games if you're skilled with them. Moving down, we've got tier 2, which is the decks that, aren't quite as good as the tier 1 decks, but can still win a fair amount of the time, even against the tier 1 threats. And below those, we've got Rogue, which are the decks that, aren't really quite there competitively, but if they do manage to pull off their combo and things go right for them, then they can make it pretty tough for their opponent and pretty convincingly win the match. But it usually does have to be like things going right for them, as opposed to just you playing well. And lastly, we've got the decks that are trash tier, which, I'm not saying these decks can never win, they definitely can, but it really takes a miracle most of the time for them to win. But before we dive in to the tier ranking itself, if you're not already subscribed to my channel, please do so. I cover a variety of obscure historical formats, and we are soon going to be moving into the next one, which I'm tentatively calling Jar format, which will introduce Morphing Jar and introduce a lot of new complexity to this current treasure format. So it should be very fun, and if you want to be notified when those videos come out, subscribing will let you do that. In addition, we have a Discord server, link will be in the description down below, but it's a great place to find games in all these obscure formats that aren't really played anywhere else. So if you're interested, definitely check it out in the description down below. We'd love to have you and play some games. And lastly, if you enjoyed the video, as always, please leave a like down below. But with all that out of the way, let's start at the top of the list, which is in alphabetical order, so not by, power ranking or anything. And we're going to be starting with Banisher of the Light. Now, Banisher of the Light is an interesting card here because it's not quite a uniform strategy. It's just sort of an anti-meta strategy. So you can build it a lot of different ways. I honestly think Banisher of the Light could potentially have a place in a good stuff deck, just as a 2k defender, that also has the added benefit of messing up your opponent's critters and recruiters. So, Banisher of the Light itself as a card has a lot of different sort of shelves that you can play it in. But when I think of Banisher of the Light, I think of a deck going like sort of all in on the strategy, maybe playing Shining Angels, maybe playing a bunch of counter traps to keep Banisher on field while you sort of run over all your opponent's monsters. And if that is the deck we're talking about, then I think that it's not actually tier 1. I think it's either tier 2 or Rogue. And honestly, based on my experience with the deck, I feel like I might actually put it in Rogue. And my reasoning for this is that it can really mess up your opponent's plays, but it can also mess up your plays when Banisher is on the field. And it's a very passive sort of deck. Like, it doesn't have too much offensive pressure. And again, this does depend on the way that you play it. The build that I played focused more on just protecting your Banisher and having some offensive pressure, but mainly having more defensive pressure to protect your Banisher. And I think that version of the deck is not the best. So I'm going to put it in Rogue. I think in the future with more experimentation with this card and deck, this could definitely rise, maybe to tier 2. Probably not tier 1, I think, but definitely a tier 2 contender maybe in the future. Moving on, we have our first tier 1 deck that I'm going to talk about here, and that is Burn. I think Burn is very good. I mean, as I said, I think it's just a shoo-in for tier 1. As cards like Chain Energy and Toll and Just Desserts can just make things so tough for your opponent and really just lock them out of the game if you're not able to get aggressive quickly enough. The deck can also make use of great cards like Giant Germ, Spear Cretin, Cannon Soldier to just stall out your opponent and burn your opponent, and Just Desserts at the end of the game is also a killer play. So I think that, Burn is a very, very good deck. Definitely a top tier contender in the format, and so that's why it's tier 1. Next up, we have a deck that I also think is tier 1, another sort of stalling deck, and that is Mill. Now, whether this goes above or below Burn is a bit of an interesting question. I personally think it probably goes below Burn in this format, which does hurt me a little to say, as I love this sort of Mill deck. I mean, yes, I'm a degenerate. I like Empty Jar. So I don't think all the pieces are quite there yet to make Mill super, super good. It is very, very good though. And, it can really give a lot of decks a lot of trouble as it's sort of operating on a different axis than a lot of other decks are. As it's not trying to kill you through damage, it's just trying to kill you through decking you out. And with things like Cyberjar, Spear Cretin, and Card Destruction, it has a lot of tools at its disposal to enable it to do so. So I think that Mill is right up there in tier 1 with Burn. And it is a deck that you have to be prepared for in this format, and you've got to know how to play against, because it does require a different play style to defeat this deck. Our next deck that we're going to cover is Clown Control. And Clown Control, I think, is actually a lot better in this format than it was in last format, which is why my sort of designation for the decks that don't quite make the cut in this tier list is no longer Dream Clown like it was in my MRL format ranking. Dream Clown has sort of become its own card in the Clown Control deck that is very good. So I actually think this deck is tier 2. I think there are a lot of interesting synergies that make this very good, and I think it is very good against Burn and Mill, especially because you can sort of switch your clowns to defense or attack to pop your opponent's flip monsters that can give you a lot of trouble. So I really think that Clown Control is a very good deck, and things like Rush Recklessly, which don't really see any other play, can see play in this deck to great effect. That can make it quite a surprise for your opponent and can make it quite difficult for your opponent to deal with. In addition, playing additional recruiters like Giant Rats can give the deck a bit more consistency than a lot of other decks have, as it enables you to thin out your deck a bit while also continuing to get monsters on the board. So I think that Clown Control is a tier 2 contender in this format for sure, and I'm excited to see what people do with the deck in the future, as I think it is somewhat underexplored. Moving on though, we've got a deck that I didn't actually cover in this format because, I didn't really think it would be that interesting, and also I think it's pretty obvious where this deck lies. We've got Exodia, and I'm going to put this in trash tier, honestly. This isn't to say that Exodia can't win games. Of course, Exodia definitely can win games. But with decks playing the 3 hand rips in the main deck, and Mill being a tier 1 deck in this format, I feel like Exodia has just fallen very far from its tier 1 status in Critter. I think that the deck just insta-loses too much of the time, and so I don't really think it's that good. And that's why I didn't show a video with it, because I think it's pretty clear that the introduction of the hand rips do sort of signal the death knell of this deck. You can definitely play it, and you can definitely cheese your opponent if they're not expecting it, but most of the time, playing Exodia will just lead to a disappointing defeat. Moving on, we've got Harpy Ladies, and Harpy Ladies gained some interesting support in this set. Rising Air Current I think does have a place in the deck, and Flying Kamakiri can be used to tutor out Harpy Lady. However, do I think that this is good enough to make the deck tier 1 or tier 2? No, I think that it's definitely either rogue or trash. Based on my experience with the deck, I might lean trash, but, I think overall the deck can potentially OTK, which could maybe put it in rogue. But I don't know, I feel like OTK decks are a lot harder to pull off this format with things like Mystic Tomato that can fetch out other monsters from the deck to replace itself, which makes it a lot harder to make an offensive push unless you have a lot of both spell and trap removal and monster removal. And so I think that this deck, honestly, might be trash. And, to be fair, I'm judging this on a very limited sample size. I didn't play the deck too much, and my build probably was flawed. So I think with more tinkering and experimentation, this deck could definitely rise to rogue, in my opinion. But I just think OTK decks like Harpy Lady are a lot harder to pull off this format. And I think that oftentimes you'll just lose before you get a chance to actually pull off the OTK. So that's why Harpy Lady I'm putting in trash for now, but I'd be happy to be proved wrong in the future. Moving on, we've got the Good Stuff deck, which I'm just symbolizing by Mechanical Chaser, as it's just the vanilla beater that's the best in this format. And I think that this deck is tier 1, and I think it's above Burn, personally. I don't know. The tier 1 decks are sort of, they all compete against each other, and they're all on a similar power level. But I think that you're going to see Good Stuff the most out of the tier 1 decks, because people don't really like the Burn and Mill playstyle as much as just a generic Good Stuff playstyle. So I feel like for that reason, Good Stuff belongs at the top of tier 1, just because you're more likely to see it. But, there's not really much to say about this deck. It's just the good cards in the format sort of stuffed together. And there are different ways that you can build it, but no matter how you build it, it's going to be pretty good. And it's going to be tier 1 because it's just the best cards in the format together. So, of course, it's going to be one of the best decks. Moving on to our next deck, we've got Equip Aggro. So this is a deck that uses things like Megamorph and Axe of Despair in conjunction with like Jiraigumo or Dark Elf or even Mahavelo if you want, although I don't really think Mahavelo does anything for the deck itself. But it uses all these monsters together with the equip spells to try and sort of wipe out your opponent's life points and go for an OTK, or just boost up your monsters to make them very formidable. Now, I feel like this sort of deck, kind of like the Harpy OTK deck, there's just too many things going against it, especially when your opponent's likely playing 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon, which can turn your equip spells into a big liability. As you equip a spell to your monster, then attack in, and your opponent activates Mystical Space Typhoon, then you could lose both the equip spell and the monster all at once. So, I don't think that the Equip Aggro deck is that good. I think it's rogue, though. I think that just being able to equip your equip spells to a monster without having to go for a big OTK push does make it better than something like Harpies. And so I think that it's definitely not trash, but I don't quite think it cracks into tier 2, as it just doesn't do enough, I think. And the equip spells can be major bricks in your hand. But again, just like with Harpies, just like with Banisher, just like with any of these decks, I'd be happy to be proved wrong and see this deck rise in the future, as there are some interesting ways you can build it that could potentially increase its viability. Moving on, we've got Relinquished, which I think is one of the coolest decks in this format, and I'm very happy to say that I do think that it belongs in tier 2. Not sure if it goes above Clown Control or below it. I think I'm going to put it below. I'm going to put it above Clown Control, because it's just so cool. Relinquished is the only ritual monster that's really worth playing, in my opinion, in this format. And I think it's a card that just does things that no other card does. And it has multiple effects, which is very rare to see at this time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. And it's just really sick and can lend itself to a really cool control deck. In addition, the sort of ritual support monsters, Sonic Bird and Senju of the Thousand Hands, are really good at deck thinning, which can make this deck really excel in the late game as you've sort of gone through your chaff and you're just drawing all your power cards. So I think this is really sick. I think it's got some very interesting applications against some of the top decks in the format, and it also is a very fun deck to play. So I think that it definitely belongs in tier 2. It definitely can win games pretty well if it's being piloted by a skilled pilot, even though it is a bit more difficult to play than some of the other decks on this list. Moving on, we've got Hand Control, which, I'm not really a fan of Hand Control as a deck, but I do think that it's probably tier 2. It's basically just watered down good stuff, in my opinion. You're playing things like Robin Goblin and White Magical Hat, to just increase the amount of discards you can do against your opponent, which is fine. It's just that those cards do take some setup, so it's kind of like a win more strategy, in my opinion. And for that reason, I don't really like it as much as some of the other decks on this list, even the decks that are below it in terms of the power ranking. But I do think that it's a very adequate deck, so I'm going to put it at tier 2. I think it can win games pretty well because it is basically just a watered down good stuff list. And if you are able to pull off the Robin Goblin and White Magical Hat, that can be pretty powerful. So I think it's tier 2. I'm putting it at the bottom of tier 2 because I think, while it is less involved than the other decks on this tier, I think that it will see less play because the other decks are just, frankly, more interesting than this one is. So I'm putting it at bottom of tier 2. I think that all these decks are pretty similar in terms of power level, but Dream Clown and Relinquished just do more interesting things, and so I like them better. Next up, we've got Toons, which I'm representing with Toon Summon Skull here. I think that this deck is bad. I'm going to put it in trash above Exodia, but, it takes way too much setup. You need to have Toon World on the field. Toon World is unsearchable, and if you don't draw it, then all your monsters are basically dead in hand. Your monsters can't attack the turn they're brought out, which, you can sort of mitigate using things like Soul Exchange and the like. But, it's just a very disappointing deck, as it's just so vulnerable to so many different types of removal. And, there are different ways to build this that I have seen in the Discord. People taking this in different directions than the version that I showed off in my video, which, if this does ride in the future, I'd be very happy about it because I always love when jank decks, sort of outperform what people expect them to. But I think for now, this deck is just firmly in trash tier. I don't think it's really that good. And lastly, I would be remiss if I pretended that the decks on this tier list are all the decks you could play in this format. There definitely are some other sorts of decks, Flash Assailant OTK is one that I've seen sort of talked about a bunch. Shadow Ghoul Turbo is another that, uses Painful Choice and Shadow Ghoul. Like, there's a lot of very interesting synergies that you can build decks around in this format. But I don't necessarily think that any of those decks are that good. They're very gimmicky and very funny if you're able to pull them off. But I think that, they sort of belong in this trash tier. And I'm representing them with the Cheerful Coffin, as I think it's a pretty bad card, even though it's a very funny card. And I think that a lot of these decks fall into a similar sort of categorization. So I'm putting that in trash tier, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong. And I will likely revisit this format in the future as people experiment with it more and sort of figure out new strategies that I may have missed. So this tier list could definitely change in the future, but that's my take on the decks in this format. I will leave a link to this tier list in the description down below, so if you want to make your own sort of tier list, feel free to do so. But with that, my coverage of Treasure format has ended for now, and we'll be moving directly into Jar format after tomorrow's video, which will likely be a Throwback Tuesday video, revisiting an earlier format. But expect a guide to Jar format coming later in this week. And I'm really excited to dive into it, although my coverage of it probably will be a little bit shorter than my coverage of Treasure format, as there are a bit less decks that are viable in that format. But let me know your thoughts on this tier list down in the comments down below. Do you think I greatly underrated or overrated a specific deck? Or do you think that I had a glaring omission to this tier list? Let me know down in the comments below, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGOs from Zero, and I'm signing off.